Okay, so as I said, I'm recording this. This is session 4, and all the material is under session 4 for what we're going to look at today. Today is actually not very long. It's just looking at internationalization. And you can see here, internationalization is often abbreviated i118n, which is just basically all the characters between the I and the N, and that's just the way people do it. What I'm looking at is the JSTL internationalization library. Now, we're already using JSTL. It's on the class path. It's an extension to Java Server Pages, and it allows you to put extra tags in that allow you to substitute one language for another language within your actual page. I've got 2 tutorials on this. This one is the actual International Tag Library official documentation, which you can look through if you like, but more easier is this particular tutorial here, which is how to internationalize a basic JSP servlet web application. And as it says, you're using the JSTL tag lib. Now, what I've actually done in the project is I have this particular one, JSP 118n, is actually this tutorial. Basically, I've just taken it down and created it for you. The only change that I made to it was in the POM file where I added in cargo, so you could actually run it locally in a JSP using Maven Cargo Run. That's the only change. So that's the original. I'm not going to talk about the original, but that might help you if you're looking at the tutorial, just to understand what's going on. What I am going to talk about is this second one here, Spring Boot, where I basically took their work and made it into a Spring Boot application. Again, not very difficult to do, but it's just a few moving parts. First thing to say about this is that the POM here contains all the dependencies that were used in the project with the leaflet stuff that I showed you in session 1. So I've just left all of that stuff in there in the POM so that I just know it all works. But the actual application itself is somewhat different. Okay, underneath the actual application, we've got the web app, which contains both the original JSPs, that's these ones that were in that original tutorial project, but also contains new JSPs that are under the Spring view. These JSPs are actually the same as they are here. It's just have changed the name. There's no other change in them really, other than the name. It's just to show you that the view is using a different set of JSPs than the ones that are just rendered up natively. So before I go any further, I'm going to actually run this application and I'll show you what it does, and then I'll go back and look at the code. Okay, so this is the actual project. Maven clean install. And it's just going to go through the process it normally goes through. And then Maven Maven Spring Boot 1. And because it's got all the libraries in the class path that the other project had, it's going to spin up a load of JPA stuff as well, but it doesn't actually have any repositories or anything, so it's just spun up, but it's not doing anything with it. So that's the application running. And if I go to localhost, you'll see that's the index page for the application. So let me just, this is the same application here. So if you look under the web app, that's the index page that's showing up. You know, just go to non-Spring application, go to Spring application. And if I go again to this, you can see go to non-Spring application, go to Spring application. If I go to the non-Spring application, it brings up that change local JSP. So this is running without using any Spring Boot stuff particularly. And if you change the session local to English, go to the sample page, nothing clever there. But if you go to German, go to the sample page, you'll see it's in German. Chinese, go to the sample page, you'll see it's in Chinese. So that's the original application using the original JSPs. If I go back and look at the Spring MVC application, it looks exactly the same, but in this case, there's no .jsp on the end of the link, which is then going to go to the controller, which I'll show you in a minute. But it's exactly the same as before. Session local, I'll look at the cookie local. In this case, same thing, go to sample page and go back. Now, the difference between these two examples, the session local and the cookie local, is that in the session local, when I say I want to be in German and I go to the sample page, the fact that I'm using German is stored as a session variable. And when I log out and log back in, it won't be there. The session variable only lasts for the session. So that's one example that they've given in the tutorial to say, if you just want this particular language to last for the session, then use a session variable. But the other example that uses the cookie, and you go to the sample page, if I logged out and logged back in, or if I went and used another browser, but I'm sorry, not another browser, but if I open another page, another session on this, because the information is stored in the cookie, every time you come back to that application, the cookie is going to be used to set the language until you change the language, and that'll change the cookie, and then you'll change the language. So that's the difference. The cookie is something that's set in the browser and stays with the browser, and whenever you go to that site, will always be rendered up. But the session is only for that session. So the cookie will stay with that particular browser forever until you change it. All right. So that's the difference. So that's what it looks like. Let me have a look at how it works. So this is the code. As we said, we've got these Spring JSPs, and you can see that in the JSP, what you've got is this format message tag, which is the JSTL tag, and then it comes up with, label.choose request local, label.choose local content, change language, whatever. Okay. So where does that come from? Well, it comes from these properties files. So under messages.properties, you can see that's the key and that's the value, all very English. But if I do it in Chinese, that's the key. And because these are Chinese characters, what they've done is they put in the Unicode here, because clearly you can't put anything else in there. So if you wanted to do a language that, isn't easily translatable, you put the Unicode in for that language. In French, it's a bit more easy. You put in the actual characters in the French. Okay, so the way the application works is it's going to look for these properties files, and depending on which language you've chosen, it'll pick the right properties file. And then in the JSP itself, if we go back to that JSP, you'll see it actually just substitute the message for that key. And that's really all there is to it. All right. Look at the tutorial, give you a bit more detail, but that's all you need to do. Okay. Now, just a few other things on this, just so that you understand what's going on. First thing is these cookie local filters and session local filters. Now that is a change. That is something different. And you'll see in the JSP 118 example, it also has the cookie local filters and the session local filters. So that's something that's been taken from the tutorial and added in. It's actually nothing to do with Spring as such, okay? So the session local filter, if we look at it, it's annotated with web filter, and Tomcat, whenever it starts up, will look at that, or any Jetty or any web application server will look for any classes that are annotated web filter, and will include those then in its requests chain. And what the filter actually does is it takes the servlet request, modifies it, and then sends back the response. So if you imagine a request coming in, it goes through the filter, And the request goes into the filter changes the request, it goes to the next filter, the next filter, the next filter, and it does the same thing on the way out. So you filter stuff going in, you filter stuff going out. All the filter does is it's like a pre-processor before you get to your real application, and then it's a pre-processor on the way out. Now this is just doing it on the in. So on the in, we're getting the request, and we're looking for the parameter session local. And if the session local is set, then we set the language. And then that language, lang, is what is actually used by the JSP and JSTL to choose what language is being used. And that's how it works for picking up the request parameter and setting the language for the JSPs. In the cookie local filter, you're doing exactly the same thing, but in this case, you're finding the parameter cookie local, and then you're actually creating a new cookie and you're adding it into the response. So the response will go back with that cookie you've created, and that cookie will contain that information. And then every time you start up again, it will look for that cookie and it will make it happen. Again, look at the tutorial. It'll give you more details on this. But this stuff basically sits there, and all the requests coming in are pre-filtered before they go to Spring, and then pre-filtered on the way back out again. The only other thing I need to talk about in this is, well, two things really, is the page controller. So remember, for Spring, in the case of normal JSPs, the normal JSPs are just, they're just rendered directly. But in the case of Spring, it goes to the page controller first. So change local doesn't have .jsp on the end of it. If that's seen as the request, then we will go to that page, change local Spring, and we'll render up this page here. And the same with cookie local, request local, or whatever. It just renders up these pages. So that's the only change I've made for the Spring stuff, except for in the international application itself. So this is a Spring Boot application. All the other examples have got a class like this that extends the Spring Boot servlet initializer. The one thing I did need to change was this servlet component scan to pick up those two filters. So it goes to that and finds those two filters. If you don't have that, then when you do Spring Boot run, it can't find those filters and it just won't work. But if you do have this, it'll find the filters and Spring Boot run will work fine. That only is an issue when you're running a Spring Boot run. If you're running in a web application, then the web container itself will find those and Spring doesn't need to worry about it. So that's the only reason why this particular little annotation is added in there. It's so that Spring Boot will actually pick it up when you're running it locally in Maven. But if you're running it in a container, these filters will be found anyway. Okay, so I think I've covered everything I need to give you just a basic understanding of how internationalization works. What you would probably do is, you've obviously got your own JSPs. If you're using that example where you've got the header and footer JSPs, what you probably want to do is take this stuff here, the set local and the set bundle base name, and also the JSTL format, which is this, put those in your header, and then all your pages will be able to pick up the local and pick up the messages. So you can change your pages then to have the messages. That's really all you would need to do. The other example where we had the leaflet app, again, just put these extra headers in and, and then change all of your text to use these format message keys. And again, it should just work. But, that's obviously something for somebody to get on with, to try and internationalize it and then push it back into your main web app once you've done that. Okay, I'll stop the recording there, but if there's any questions,